Radio Free Intimate, episode 239. This week, surprisingly brought to you by Metal Archives, or rather by something wacky that happened to me on Metal Archives. If you've never been to that website, you might be tempted to go on their forum. If so,
Stop, don't come back.
Yeah, you're gonna want to avoid doing that. Now, the most fun that can be had nowadays with that particular site is with the similar artists button on any given artist's page, because a lot of times it's fun just to see what the hell kind of garbage gets recommended on there to laugh at it, but other times you might actually find something new and interesting. For instance, the band Versailles, who I've talked about ad nauseum, as I'm sure some of you would agree. Their similar artist page is pretty decent. You know, there's a lot of bands that you would expect on there. Galnarius, X-Japan, Moi de Moi, Matinro Opera. But then I scroll down and I see something that says
Kokumaromilk.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
well, apparently Kokumaru is some kind of curry sauce or something. And then milk is, that white jug in the fridge what got the red label on it says it's got vitamin D in it. And apparently, this wacky band decided to combine those two concepts into their name. It's a two-man project, or in this case, a man and a woman. Hiroyuki Iwama does all the instruments, and some nice lady named Yuzu does the vocals. Now, this wouldn't be the only case where a band kind of sounds like Versailles, you know, a mixture of gothic metal and power metal, but has a female vocalist. In fact, one of my favorite albums that came out this year was the second album from Mai Yajima. And obviously that's good stuff, but does Kokumaromilk sound like that at all? Do they even really sound like Versailles? Well, outside of using guitars, drums, bass, and keyboards and having neoclassical and like mild power metal elements,
No way. Not this time. We made it up.
and honestly, you should have been clued in to that fact just from that weird-ass band name. These guys play some kind of wacky avant-garde metal. Now, you know, avant-garde metal can be good or it can be bad. It can be Psy and Arcturus, or every other band that isn't Psy or Arcturus.
아니 촬영했던 거 하다 보면은
Okay, fine. There are some other good avant-garde metal bands. You got all that like Czech avant-grind stuff, such as that Hermaphrodite band I covered last July on episode 179, or Anobi and Zipoan Vitens from Lithuania. But by and large, a surprising amount of the really good avant-garde metal either comes from Japan or Norway. I don't know if it's just 'cause they're both long, skinny countries, or if some dark pact was made back during antediluvian aeons in the midst of the Finno-Korean hyperwar. But Kokumaromilk is from Japan, and while to call them similar to the band Versailles just because of that is more than a bit of a stretch, some of the other bands on Kokumaromilk's own similar artist page give a much better context for what they sound like. For instance, there is Psy, and specifically if I'm going to compare Kokumaromilk to Psy, it's going to be stuff like Hail Horror Hail. With some very power metal-esque guitar heroics mixed with some kind of weird psychedelic sound collage. They don't sound like Scorn the Feet era Psy. They don't really sound like Air to Despair era Psy. But Hail Horror Hail, hell yeah, you could tell that these guys were probably listening to that. The other Japanese band that shows up on their recommended artist page is Gonin Ishu, which has actually shared a drummer with Psy in the past. If you haven't heard Gonin Ishu before, this is what they sound like. Somewhat similar to Psy, but less of an emphasis on making sort of like a horror movie soundtrack, sound collage type thing, and way more emphasis on technicality and very sprawling song structures. Real long songs. And a female vocal performance that I would best describe as schizophrenic, or at the very least borderline personality disorder. She's very emotive and tuneful during the cleaner portions of her vocal performance. But then when we start to transition into the heavier stuff, she gets really nasty sounding, total deranged mental patient. And I don't know about you guys, but I like it. It sounds fucking cool. So now that we know that Kokumaromilk has elements of Psy from that whole time period where they had a lot of power metal influence and were making these albums that changed moods a whole lot and used sound collage kind of make a movie without any images to it. And the sprawling, long-ass song structures and female vocal schizophrenia of Gonin Ishu. The question remains, are they any good at it?
야 나를 완전 제대로 잡.
Well, yeah, obviously I think they're good at it. Otherwise I would be doing an episode on them. I'm just trying to build suspensey. But speaking of building suspense, that's basically Kokumaromilk's entire MO. They have a very wave-like compositional structure. They're all about having an ascending part that builds up really quickly to a point, immediately followed by a descending part that kind of tears the whole structure to pieces before descending back down to go to that ascending part over again. And they keep repeating that pattern. A really good example of this would be the title track on their most recent release, Warutsumi, or The Sea God. This is the ascending part, and this is the descending part back into heavier variation of the ascending part, followed by another cycle of descent and ascent. You see what I mean when I say it has a very wave-like song structure? It's always up, down, up, down. And I think I hear Yuzu in the background. It should become more important later. This section of the song also introduces one of the most prominent neoclassical elements.
This is fire!
That being the heavy use of electric violin, as well as their oddly minimalistic transition riffs. And now we're into another ascendant section. Very beautiful and mysterious sounding, building up to one of those dissolution sections right here. And then it goes right back into the ascending section after tearing itself apart. This music is as beautiful as it is disturbing. Some of the most nihilistic songwriting that I've ever had the pleasure to hear. You see what I mean? Borderline personality disorder as typified by a vocal performance. She is really good at going absolutely crazy and histrionic out of nowhere.
Wow, man, freaked out!
Early on, I mentioned their penchant for creating a very cinematic atmosphere similar to the band Psy in the mid-90s. The best example of Kokumaromilk doing so would be on their second album, Shoujo Shofu. And the movie they are making on this album is bizarre, contradictory, at times immediately bouncing very cutesy and very horrific ideas off of each other. If I were to compare it to any actual movie, it would be the 1977 Japanese horror movie House, which I believe was based on the director's young daughter narrating the kind of stuff she was dreaming about, and then him making a horror movie out of it. So it's in different turns, kind of like cutesy and kitschy, and then all of a sudden it goes like full Evil Dead. And speaking of weird contradictions, this album title, much like the band's name themselves, is an odd mashup of two different terms. Although before it was just two types of food that don't go together. Now it's shoujo and shofu. Shoujo essentially translates as girl. Shofu means whore, but the way they've juxtaposed them and the meaning of it on the overall album comes out to something like virgin prostitute, which obviously is two completely different concepts and also rather disturbing, which fits this album because it is a weird and wild ride.
Boo! Haunted house!
I wanted to play this song in particular, Hai Kaburi Hime, or Ash Suffering Princess, because it really shows up the strength of their neoclassical influence during this ascending section right here, which immediately collapses into some kind of weird blend of stoner metal and thrash metal, before introducing Yuzu playing a variety of different characters with her voice, which I think is one of her strong suits. In this case, we have her doing this kind of ghostly and also kind of childish cadence over some pretty intense power metal. But when we transition into the dissolution section right here, all the childishness is gone and replaced by this very sharp, ranting tone. Very nervous and hurried sounding. Totally panicked state, leading back into that odd thrash metal riff from earlier. This song is a constant push-pull between those two atmospheres, the childish, cutesy one, and the much more panicked-sounding Total Mental Breakdown. And speaking of that, holy fuck. Now the horror movie elements have fully kicked in, with this odd little soundscape interlude that then brings us back into some of that Panicked, ranting, nervous verse from earlier, but now it's like even crazier with the overdubs, as well as the part where she goes like... I mean, that's probably the craziest she ever gets on this album, and man, is it glorious. Really fits the cacophonous nature of the music going underneath, with all these keyboards and violins, and something that sounds like Malice Miser if it was written by a serial killer instead of just a crazy person that does whacking cooking videos on YouTube. That's what I mean when I say this album is like a movie without any pictures to it. You make up your own wacky movie in your mind, which is what Psy was very much about during the Hail Horror Hail period, and what Kokumaromilk is about to an even greater extent. Speaking of which, we have now reached the point in this movie where the world ends. This is the collapsing tipping point of the story. And I'm not talking about whatever story the lyrics are telling, because...
I can't understand you. Go back to your country.
Yeah, I don't know what that wacky lady's saying at all. I got, like a couple of assorted kokuros and choo-choos, and that's about it. I'm talking about the movie that the music is making here. And this is where I think the Psy influence really comes in. Because at the exact midpoint of Psy's classic album Hail Horror Hail, this happens. We take a journey into wacky soundscape land, led there by an air raid siren and these weird mechanical drums and odd guitar jangling with very deep sonorous bass notes and foreboding keyboards before the next song drops us off somewhere much more pleasant with this subdued, vaguely funky track featuring some of Mirai Kawashima's strangest vocal performance. He's almost doing this like black metal scat singing thing. That 1-2 punch of weird songs is perhaps the most memorable moment on an album consisting almost entirely of incredibly memorable moments. Apparently I'm not the only one that holds that opinion, because after 3 tracks of that furious neoclassical avant-garde power metal, goth metal, whatever the hell it was, this is what happens on Kokumaromilk's second album. We have a very similar air horn-led, semi-ambient track, but instead of the really electronic feel of the one on the Psy album, in this case, we end up somewhere in between Godflesh and Swans, with the overriding poetic narration, very jammy drums. The lead melodic instrument is the bass guitar, and the guitars are just doing a whole lot of weird feedback. This is actually the longest song on the album at 9.5 minutes, and it certainly takes its time, but there is definitely a whole lot of gradual development over the course of the track, with the drums gradually increasing in complexity and the bass wandering into all these different melodic nooks and crannies over the course of a very long solo. Eventually the clean vocals come back, but in this case they are heavily modified and washed out sounding into this almost angelic processor Yesu sounding post-metal funeral dirge. And with that outro, they lead us from perhaps the darkest moment of the album into by far the lightest and most upbeat, with a rather unexpected digression into some kind of big band music fusion with some variety of chilled out funk music. And it's only going to get stranger once the vocals actually do make their miraculous reappearance, where we have 2 styles of vocalizations fighting for center stage. One being this kind of lounge singer thing, and the other one almost being these Vocaloid sounding vocal stings. Kind of going back and forth between those vocal stings and the lounge singer stuff before they end up synthesizing themselves into one combined approach, with the Vocaloid choir acting as sort of a backing vocal to the danceable 1920s-ish like jazz singer stuff. It's definitely strange. But speaking of synthesizing approaches, what's even cooler is the final song on the album actually manages to combine all of that weird neoclassical avant-garde power metal of the early half with the more spaced out sounds of the second half, and making something really unique. It starts out very medieval folk sounding. I mean, check out the backing vocal right here, before bringing in more metallic elements. I don't want to get too annoying in K-pop with this. I'll just say that I absolutely love her vocals on this track. It feels like a warm blanket. And I'm thinking this is probably the closest she gets to her natural singing voice instead of a character, because it certainly feels a whole lot more natural. And it's a great way to finally reintroduce the heavy metal elements. I mean, what an album. If I was some sort of writing for Pitchfork, I'd probably use a whole lot of silly terms like tour de force. As it stands, I'm just going to say this is a really good emotional climax to the album, bringing together all the different elements that happened over the course of the album in a way that surprisingly makes you feel kind of good, even after you listen to a whole bunch of disturbing shit. The EP that came out 2 years after this, Watatsumi, of which I actually introduced this band to you with the title track, saw them getting even more experimental by, apart from that big long title track, mostly leaving the long song structures behind in favor of more compact ones. We're talking about like 3-minute long songs, which is highly unusual for them, and yet they managed to cram in all of the same amount of development that we've come to expect from them. For instance, this song entitled Azato Neji, or Bruises and Screws, they're going with a really heavy electronic element, complete with that distorted GABA snare, and the controversial re-emergence of the weird Vocaloid-sounding vocals. This is the build-up section, and here's the dissolution, where it turns into some kind of weird danceable death metal for a while with a whole lot of different wacky shifts and sections, such as this one where they essentially double-time the music, speed it up a little bit, or this one right here, where they go back and forth with some clean vocals before finally collapsing to some bizarre parody of slam death. I mean, listen to those vocals. That shit is ridiculous. And as you would expect, they don't stick on that for too long, as then we go back into some very silly dance music. And honestly, this blend kind of does make sense to me, because both slam death and whatever kind of goofy Japanese dance music this is are both intensely rhythmic and also inherently ridiculous. But speaking of all that Vocaloid stuff, okay, here is the ultimate plot twist with Kokumaromilk. I was trying to buy their stuff on Discogs a couple weeks ago. They didn't have any of it. In fact, the only thing that they did have for sale with the Kokumaromilk name on it was something that the main guy behind all the instruments in Kokumaromilk played bass for. A rather obscure little bit of Japanese esoterica known as supercell. Oh, shit! You heard that right. Kokumaromilk guy plays bass for goddamn Hatsune Miku, like Black Rock Shooter era. That is just wild to me. And it also means that there's a good chance that Corey Flockster, of all people, has heard the guy from Kokumaromilk and not realized it.
Now what the fuck is that all about? That's bullshit.
And honestly, I can't think of a better way than that to close this particular chapter of RFI, wherein we covered what is undoubtedly the oddest band I have covered yet, and probably will be the weirdest band ever covered on this show, because I can't think of anything stranger than that. But hopefully you had a good time during this wacky avant-garde cinematic journey. Thanks so much for listening or watching or however you got a hold of this, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, bro. And that's the whole reason the punk movement started.
Hey, bro, get us down in your house and smoke for a little bit without being judged.
Well, not on camera, no, you have to go outside for that, because, like...
Oh, god damn, fucking nuts.